It is my pleasure to chair this first panel of today's proceedings on the legal dimension of the Vietnam War. Although the scholarly literature on the Vietnam War is voluminous and continues to grow, the legal aspects of the war is less well known, or to borrow our first speaker, Dr. Madelaine Chiam's words, did not capture the imagination of a wider public. Consequently, as Professor Falk, we've heard this morning, lamented in the foreword of his recently published collected writings, 40 years after the defeat of the United States in Vietnam, the central lessons of the war remain unlearned. Even worse, the mistakes made and crimes committed in Vietnam have been repeated at great human, material, and strategic costs in a variety of subsequent national settings. The passage of time has not tempered the immediacy of the Vietnam War. While the war itself is more distant, the legal issues it raised are strikingly current. They stimulate debate because they are fundamental. To revisit the Vietnam War international law, we have our first speaker, Dr. Madelaine Chiam, who teaches at the La Trobe Law School in Melbourne. Her interest and expertise is in the area of international law, the histories of international law, the global and local dimensions of international law, and the role of international law in public debate, which is the subject of a presentation this morning. May I introduce Dr. Chiam?
Thank you, Victor and Brian, very much for inviting me to be part of this workshop, and to all the people at the Middle East Institute for looking after us so well thus far. So some of you, or if you know anything about Chinese surnames and you've looked at my surname, you might recognize it as a Hainanese surname. And indeed, I am originally from Singapore. So I moved to Australia at the end of secondary 2, so that's the second year of high school. And when I was a kid growing up here, and I went to a school called Marymount Convent School, NUS loomed very large in my imagination as this extremely important place that we all had to work very hard to try to get into. And this is the first time in my academic travels that I've managed to come to NUS, so it's a real pleasure to be giving this paper at this place that loomed so large in my imagination when I was a kid. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about a series of public exchanges about the legality of the Vietnam War and the US military intervention in Vietnam in particular. And these exchanges took place in 1965 and 1966, so before the magic year of 1967. So think of them as kind of setting a scene, if you like. And one of the key players in those debates, and whose work I'm going to talk about a little bit, is Richard Falk. And so it's wonderful that he also has managed to give some context to what I'm about to talk about later. But before talking about those debates in particular, I want to give you a little bit of a context about how I'm looking at these debates and why I think public debates about international law matter for international law itself, so for the field. If you've ever, and I won't shock me if you haven't, but if you've ever put international law into a search engine for news, you'll find amazingly that it turns up a remarkable number of results. So just when I did it for this paper for the 2 months of October and November of 2018, headlines like, "Does repatriation of Rohingya breach international law?" "Khashoggi merger, a triple violation of international law." Erdogan says US sanctions on Iran are against international law. So it gives us a sense that international law is a common part of public debate. And armed conflicts tend to generate a particularly intense focus on international law. So, for example, at different stages, media headlines have narrated the conflict in Syria with titles including, "Is Trump's Syria strike changing international law?" or "Saving Syria, is international law the answer?" And international lawyers who have thought about the pervasiveness of international law in public debate often express themselves to be perplexed by the very fact that questions of international legality generate news headlines. So we're quite insular as a field, and we don't understand why other people are interested in a way. And the one example I have of this comes from the height of the 2003 Iraq War debates, when Professors Philip Allott and Alan Dashwood, who are very notable international law scholars, wrote in a letter to the Times newspaper of London, so they themselves were participating in the public debate. And they said, the question of legality of the use of armed force against Iraq has assumed a surprising prominence. And Allott and Dashwood were not happy about this. International law on the use of force was not, they said, a series of laws to be construed and applied like the Road Traffic Act. So in their view, international law was too complex and to become a part of public debate. And obviously Richard Falk, as we just heard, represents another view on that. So in a larger research project, I'm looking at the role of international law in public debates, and particularly debates about war. And I'm interested in particular at who the people who spoke international legal language were, the forms, what I call the forms of international legal language that they employed, and how they characterized what they were doing when they used international law. And I'm trying in my research to understand what it means for international law when people who are not necessarily international lawyers, although quite often they are, use that language in the public sphere. So this is a focus on the language in the public sphere. And then what is the role in public debates for expert international lawyers if international law is being used in multiple ways, including, for example, as a language of justification and a language of protest, as Professor Falk identified in his keynote? And can we think about public exchanges in the language of international law as generating a new or different international law? And if so, how? So today I'm going to give you a sense of that work by discussing one example of public debate about international law from the US debates over the legality of the Vietnam War in 1965 and 66. This is obviously a tiny snapshot of those debates, but I think there's a lot that we can learn from it. And I preface this by saying that the bulk of my work on this, on Vietnam, has been done in relation to Australia. So the US work is new for me. So forgive me if I get some stuff wrong. Brian will correct me. So just so you know where the remainder of this talk is headed, first I'm going to describe the events of 65 and 66, who said what and when. Then I'm going to summarize the content of the debates, what were the key doctrinal issues in question. And finally, I'm going to offer some reflections on how international law and international lawyers were characterized in those debates and what we might learn about international law from an examination like this. Okay, so what happened in 1965 and 66? So in those years, a debate took place between lawyers in the US State Department, a group called the Lawyers Committee Concerning American Policy in Vietnam, of whom Richard Falk was a member, and individual scholars such as Falk and John Norton Moore and others published separate individual pieces on the legality of the war in Vietnam. And the debate took place in a series of fora. So there were legal memoranda that were distributed to the public, articles published in general magazines, a magazine called Dissent Magazine, which was for a broader audience, as well as specialist publications like the Yale Law Journal. And the debates also took place in the government. So in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in January and February 1966, all of these questions were raised. And the international legal debate did not capture public imagination in a significant way at this point. So it's pretty early, 65, 66. But it did gain some media coverage in newspapers, so the New York Times, and some of the debates of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee were broadcast on television. So there was the capacity for people who were just generally engaged in the issues to pay attention. Okay. So what was the subject matter of the debates? The debates considered squarely the question of the legality of the US military intervention in Vietnam. In March 1965, when the US had first enlarged its military commitment to Vietnam, the State Department had issued a document outlining the legal basis for this action. This State Department memorandum was extremely short and lacking in detail. And if any of the students in my public international law course were to submit that as assessment, it would have failed. That's how bad it was. So later then that year, in the summer of 1965, the Lawyers Committee, made up of a series of concerned individuals, including Richard Falk, produced a long and detailed memorandum of law called American Policy Vis-a-Vis Vietnam. And the Lawyers Committee distributed their memo to lawyers and law professors across the US, to 1,300, they distributed 1,300 of these. And they managed to have it read into the Congressional Record in September 1965, but it didn't really receive widespread attention at that point in 1965. But a further increase in the US military commitment in Vietnam in 1966 brought a second occasion to raise the legal arguments. And so the memorandum of the Lawyers Committee was given a further push, and political momentum really raised through two particular members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a Republican Senator, Wayne Morse of Oregon, and Democrat Senator Ernest Gruening of Alaska, who then took up the arguments that were in the Lawyers Committee memo and started to use them to question Dean Rusk when he appeared before the Foreign Relations Committee. And this attention to the legal arguments in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee then generated a further and much more comprehensive response from the State Department. And it also generated statements in support of the war, so statements saying that the war was legal, from other groups of lawyers, including the American Bar Association. So it went very bad State Department memo, Lawyers Committee memo, much better State Department memo, and then various responses to those, including finally in the middle of 1966, which is where this particular story ends, the publication of two articles by Richard Falk, one in Dissent magazine and one in the Yale Law Journal. And so I'm going to track how the debate runs in those places. Okay. The doctrinal arguments. So there were two main legal issues. First, whether the United States could be characterized as assisting South Vietnam in collective self-defense against aggression from North Vietnam. And second, whether the United States' action was justified as part of its treaty commitments, either under the Geneva Accords and or under the treaty establishing the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SEATO. So in the first memorandum, the bad memorandum from 1965, the State Department offered justifications based only on an idea of collective self-defense. And the memo characterizes the actions of North Vietnam as, I quote, continuing armed aggression against South Vietnam in violation of international agreements and international law, specifically the Geneva Accords and the UN Charter. And so according to the memo, it was this North Vietnamese aggression that justified American military support for South Vietnam as collective self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. The memo included no authorities for its legal arguments and appeared to consider authorities or any other kind of justification to be so obvious as to be unnecessary or too peripheral to matter. So in contrast to the first State Department memo, the Lawyers Committee memorandum, so the second one that came out, was a study in carefully presented, densely written, and comprehensively footnoted legal writing. The memo rebutted the State Department arguments about collective self-defense in two ways. First, the Lawyers Committee adopted a very strict reading of the Charter requirement that self-defense is justified only after an armed attack had occurred. The actions of the insurgents in South Vietnam, who were supported by North Vietnam, did not, on this reading, amount to an armed attack. And second, even if they did, the Lawyers Committee argued that under the Geneva Accords, North and South Vietnam were a single state. The conflict between them was thus civil strife, and it did not give rise to a right of an external state to intervene to support either side. The Lawyers Committee memo also included a detailed section on the American obligations under SEATO. The obligations of SEATO members had not been raised in the first State Department memo, but representatives of the US government had begun to rely on SEATO to justify US actions in Vietnam from about mid-1965. And the reliance on SEATO was usually in addition or as an alternative to the charter-based self-defense arguments. So briefly, the argument was that the US had an obligation under SEATO to defend South Vietnam, which it could exercise unilaterally. And the unilateral nature of that claim was what was really at stake here. So the Lawyers Committee memo was scathing about the SEATO arguments, and it rejected in particular the argument that the collection of disparately located members of SEATO, America, Australia, etc., could act as a regional defense arrangement. I'm quoting from the memo. If artifices like SEATO were sanctioned, the path would be opened for the emasculation of the United Nations organization and the world system of international security assiduously developed to prevent the scourge of war. The second, that's the Lawyers Committee. So then the second State Department memo, much better, still not great, but much better, Legality of US Actions in Vietnam, was issued in March 1966, and it directly responded to the Lawyers Committee memo. And this second State Department memo contained much more detail and much more legal authority than the first State Department one. So, for example, the memo repeated the arguments that the US was justified in acting in collective self-defense to protect South Vietnam, but this time it actually identified the actions that it argued amounted to an armed attack by North Vietnam and gave some justification for those. The second memo also explained the administration's assertions that its actions were justified under CETO. So, according to the State Department, the American interpretation that CETO authorized members to act unilaterally rather than collectively to protect other states under the treaty was accepted by other CETO member states. So even though it had not been anticipated at the time that the treaty had been agreed, none of the other states who were members of CETO were objecting to this idea that the US could act unilaterally under it, so that was good enough. And so the issuing, obviously, of this second State Department memo suggests that the accusations that the US actions in Vietnam were illegal, that had been made particularly in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at that point, was having some impact because they had to release a further and better, if you like, legal defense of US actions. Falk's articles also address the legal issues, and the Yale Law Journal piece in particular is a detailed examination of international law in relation to those major questions. For my purposes today, Falk's pieces are more interesting for how they characterize both international law and international lawyers. So I'm going to turn to that more general discussion now and discuss Falk at the end of that. Okay, so the debate between the Lawyers Committee and the State Department generated headlines not dissimilar to the ones that I read out at the beginning of this talk. So the New York Times wrote on the 29th of January 1966, senators challenge Rusk on Vietnam policy legality. And then a few days later, legality of Vietnam War questioned. Legality seemed to matter then, at least to the members of the Lawyers Committee, some in the State Department and the Senate, and, if newspaper coverage is a guide, to some members of the public. But unlike later Vietnam War debates, so remember this is 65-66, so it hasn't really, I mean, there's some public imagination, but it's not the mass political movement that it became. So unlike in those debates, this particular debate was not an example of ordinary people deploying international legal language as a means to speak to those in power. It was instead a case where already powerful members of an elite class of lawyers attempted to influence American policy by using international law in the public sphere. And implicit in the Lawyers Committee memorandum is the belief that exercises of government power can and should be restrained by law. The memorandum wields its international legal arguments with great conviction. Sometimes, though, the confident tone of the legal argument slips, and the wording of the memo suggests a concern that the Johnson administration will not take its international legal obligations seriously. And the second paragraph of the memo, in my view, contains what is almost an apology for this advocacy by the Lawyers Committee. So they say, and I'm quoting again, "Observance of the rule of law is a basic tenet of American democracy. Hence, it is fitting that American lawyers examine the action pursued by our government to determine whether our government's conduct is justified under the rule of law mandated by the Charter, a charter adopted to banish from the earth the scourge of war." So the lawyers are explaining why they're doing what they're doing and why it matters. And their status as lawyers makes a difference in this, in their view. So at the end of that, one of the sections in the memo implores its audience to take their arguments seriously because of who they are. So the memo said, "We as lawyers," they wrote, "have been compelled to reach this conclusion that the US action in Vietnam is illegal. We as lawyers urge our president to accept the obligations for international behavior placed upon us by our signature on the United Nations Charter." So for the Lawyers Committee, international law offered both a way to critique the policies of the Johnson administration and were also a model for how better to address the situation. Framing the Vietnam War as illegal allowed the Lawyers Committee to harness what they characterized as the power of an international law that was both transcendent, so designed to banish from the earth the scourge of war, but also standard setting. So there are constant references to the rule of law. And by emphasizing that it was lawyers authoring the memo, the Lawyers Committee was calling on their own professional expertise to add weight and legitimacy to their claims. And in contrast, the State Department's two memoranda, the first perfunctory at best, and the second forced into comprehensive justifications by the Lawyers Committee and the debates in the Senate, suggest an administration for whom international law was an afterthought, a nuisance to be managed, rather than standards to be taken into account from the outset. All of this brings us then to the article, The Two Pieces by Richard Falk. And what is striking about these two pieces is how openly Falk actually reflects on the roles of international law and international lawyers in these public debates. So in the Dissent magazine, so Dissent magazine was for a wider audience, Falk placed two contrasting images of the US next to each other. So first he said, the United States is not the sort of country that can mobilize a consensus within its own society for the effective use of military power when that use is in flagrant disregard of international law. So the public won't support a war that's in flagrant disregard of international law. And then 2 sentences later, he wrote, the United States is, however, a country in which a consensus evidently can be mobilized in support of action that is at once moderately illegal and ineffective, but may nevertheless be very costly. And these are really interesting next to each other because it seems like Falk, the advocate, is simultaneously trying to cajole his readers into agreeing about the importance of adhering to international standards and rebuking them for accepting a situation where international law has not been properly adhered to. Moderately illegal. I think that's a kind of fantastic concept. So despite this, at least in 1966, Falk is uncomfortable or appears uncomfortable about his role as advocate. It doesn't take too long where he becomes very comfortable in his role as advocate. But in 1965 and 66, he's uncomfortable with it. He's unsure about it. And in the role of international lawyers as advocates in public debates more generally. So in the Yale Law Journal article, which obviously is a specialized journal article, Falk describes the State Department memorandum as an adversary document. So a document written to justify the claims of a client, in this case, the US government. And Falk claims that an adversary document should be sharply distinguished from what he calls an impartial determination of the merits of opposed positions, which is what lawyers do. And Falk emphasizes that there are many ambiguities in the law and the use of force, determinations of what is aggression, what is armed attack, etc. And so in the journal article, he claims to be writing in the spirit of scholarly detachment rather than adversary critic, and to try to come to terms in that article with the many ambiguities of the law. But what is the impact of acknowledging the legal ambiguities in public debates about military intervention? Does it not undermine the Lawyers Committee memorandum, which Falk was key in drafting, to then publish a long article essentially saying that the law is more complicated, and thus leaving open the possibility that there is a legal justification for the US, a plausible legal justification for US military intervention in Vietnam? And Falk answered this question in his Yale article. After considering the issue a little bit, he said, the international lawyer, writing in the spirit of scholarly inquiry, may have more to contribute by raising the appropriate questions than by purporting to give authoritative answers. He may enable the public debate to adopt a more constructive and sophisticated response to the legal issues. So there's a tussle here, I think, between Falk, the advocate, who claims the US war in Vietnam is legal and unjustified, and Falk, the careful international lawyer, who has to acknowledge that there may be a possibility that the US could frame a self-defense claim that was plausible. And this tension between international lawyers advocating a public position and international lawyers being faithful to the fundamental indeterminacies of our field is a tension that has appeared in other debates. So after the 2003 Iraq War, for example, some of the academic international lawyers who had actively participated in the debates over the war wrote and published articles of their ambivalence about their public roles, and in particular their doubts about how they took these determinative positions in public over legal questions that in private they would say absolutely were completely ambiguous. So Falk's 1966 observations still resonate for international lawyers and how we might think about the role of international law and international lawyers in public debate. And one of the ways that I'm trying to think about them, or this is in the process of formation, so don't ask me complicated questions about it, is to think of this in public debate as international law spoken in different accents. So if international law is a language, maybe it has different accents in public. Okay, so in a way, the analysis that I've given you, this small snapshot of international law in American public debates, is kind of unsurprising. That a government appeared to regard international law as a relatively unimportant tool of foreign policy, and that the people who cared most about international law were the international lawyers, is consistent with realist views of international law. My hope, though, is that you are slightly convinced that closer examination of who used international law and how they used it reveals much more about, or in doing that, much more about how international law works comes into view. And so if we approach international law in this way, not only as doctrine, but as a public language, it can open up our understandings of how international law has functioned and continues to function in domestic contexts, including as a language of justification, of critique, of resistance, and even sometimes of solidarity. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Dr. Brian Cuddy, who teaches at Macquarie University in Sydney. Dr. Cuddy is a historian of 20th century international politics of the United States foreign relations. He's presently turning his Cornell PhD dissertation entitled Why the War, American Force in Vietnam, International Law, and the Transformation of Armed Conflict, 1961-1977, into a book. We might possibly get a glimpse of his forthcoming book in his presentation, but this morning he will speak on the logic of reprisal in US-Vietnam War policy debates. Can I invite Dr. Cuddy?
Thank you very much. Thanks too to Maddie for sharing a panel with me. I think our papers are going to complement each other quite nicely. Partly because I'm talking on the same, pretty much the same time period, late 64 through 65, towards the end of 65, so some definite chronological overlap, but also perhaps complementing Maddie's paper in that I'm looking at how lawyers speak in one of those accents, a different accent to the one that that Maddie talked about, and that's the internal deliberations within the regime. And of course, those internal deliberations always have an eye towards the public justification that Maddie's talked about. But I think it can be interesting and valuable to look at those internal deliberations to see what's happening before we get to those public statements and those public justifications. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I'm going to talk specifically about one legal concept known as reprisals in international law. I'm not an international lawyer, but I'll just before I start, a comment on reprisals. Reprisals is a tricky term that's often lumped in together with related terms, retaliation, retortion, and revenge. And all these terms have somewhat different meanings in international law and sort of doctrinal terms. But my paper is not going to dwell on these sort of fine differences of law so much. So forgive me, the international lawyers who do sort of look at those differences. I'm going to follow Geoffrey Best, who's quite a well-known historian of the laws of war. When he says about the topic of reprisals in one of his books, he writes, "When dealing with the painfully important topic of reprisals, which international lawyers carefully and with very good reason distinguish and separate from retaliation and revenge, we may need to remind ourselves that the international lawyer's delicate surgery may be less helpful towards the full understanding of them than a rougher socio-political analysis, which will identify their common sources and strengths. The concerns of international law," writes Best, "are too important to humanity, in this respect at least, to be left to the international lawyers." So that's just by way of introduction to say that I'm not going to get too much into sort of the doctrinal debates about what reprisals are, but in broad brushstrokes, in international legal doctrine as it developed through the 19th and early 20th centuries, reprisals were acts of force that would otherwise have been illegal except that they were permitted in particular cases in response to an enemy's violation of the law. So reprisals were in response to a violation of the law as one characteristic, and the other main one is that the goal of the reprisal had to be bringing the enemy back into conformity with the law. So that those two prongs, in response to a previous illegal act, and with the goal of bringing the enemy back into conformity with the law. And while governments, and especially militaries, argued that reprisals were necessary as law enforcement mechanisms, their use outside the heat of battle, sometimes, perhaps often against non-combatants, made them extremely controversial and much debated. Best, that historian I mentioned before, has labelled the term reprisals the most deceptive and shifty word in the whole vocabulary of the subject of the laws of war. I mentioned the differences between some of those nuanced debates about the language of reprisal retaliation. There's also a debate that I'm not going to focus on too much today. Reprisals operate in the two bodies of law that we're talking about at this conference. One about the recourse to force, sometimes known as the jus ad bellum, and one within wars, the conduct of hostilities, or the jus in bello. In the post-1945 era, where we have less of a distinction between wartime and peacetime, those two bodies of law and where reprisals are fit become a little bit more ambiguous and vague. And I'm certainly not going to try and clear up that ambiguity here, because I think that ambiguity comes out in some of the conversations that the people in my story are having. But to give a very brief history of the story of reprisal, of the doctrinal history of reprisal over the 20th century, the scope for lawful reprisals during an armed conflict, so that jus in bello category, was successively narrowed across the 20th century, in particular with the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1977 additional protocols, which we'll hear much more about after lunch. In the other body of law about the recourse to force, the dominant strand of opinion is that peacetime reprisals, as we might call them, were generally held to have been outlawed altogether by the 1945 UN Charter. In this dominant strand of opinion, the UN Charter made reprisals involving the use of force obsolete. The Charter, with its prohibition on the use of force unless approved by the UN Security Council or used in self-defence, seemingly had no place for this old world tool of statecraft. Against the lawyers, however, arose a brand of strategic thinker that saw reprisals, understood as discrete and fitting responses to particular acts of violence, as particularly suited to Cold War situations requiring some force, but not so much as to provoke all-out war. And Richard Falk talked a little bit about this earlier this morning, the changing motivations as he framed it, from one of war prevention to one of being able to wage war without escalating it to the point of catastrophe. One of those strategic thinkers, Thomas Schelling, thought the August 1964 American airstrikes on North Vietnamese patrol boats and naval installations that were a response to the Gulf of Tonkin incidents of that month delivered a neatly tailored message in response to those attacks. While the attacks certainly communicated a message of potential harm, the potential harm that the United States could inflict, they also implicitly promised a certain symmetry. There is an idiom in this interaction, described Schelling, a tendency to keep things in the same currency, to respond in the same language, to make the punishment fit the character of the crime, to impose a coherent pattern on relations. This tendency, in turn, he continued, helps to set limits and bounds. It avoids abruptness and novelty of a kind that might startle and excessively confuse an opponent. It maintains a sense of communication, of diplomatic contact, of a desire to be understood rather than misunderstood. In the final analysis, he said, these attacks in August 1965, it was as an act of reprisal, as a riposte, a warning, a demonstration that the enterprise appealed so widely as appropriate. But if this logic of reprisal that Schelling described was seen by US government officials and perhaps the broader public as appropriate at the time, the legal language of reprisal was formally shunned. The August 1964 strikes, as well as the February 1965 strikes that responded to an attack upon an American airbase in South Vietnam, were both formally justified as measures of self-defense under the UN Charter, and letters to the Security Council making this claim accompanied both sets of strikes. But on the day in February 65 in which that second set of airstrikes were launched, the Johnson administration was already looking past these tit-for-tat raids and reaching for a regularized bombing program that would respond not to individual acts of violence, but to the so-called pattern of aggression emanating from the north. In a memo passed to the US President Lyndon Johnson late that evening, the National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy recommended shifting to a policy of graduated and continuing reprisal, with the attack upon the American airbase having produced a practicable point of departure for this policy of reprisal. Bundy described this policy, he used the term sustained reprisal. He described this policy of sustained reprisal as one in which air and naval action against the North is justified by and related to the whole Viet Cong campaign of violence and terror in the South. But if the language of reprisal as such was problematic under the Charter, then so was the oxymoronic idea of sustained reprisal. In early 1965, State Department lawyers were formulating their legal justification for American military action in Vietnam, as we've just heard, and it did not take long for them to react to the proposed policy of sustained reprisal. On February the 11th, Lennon Meeker, the State Department legal advisor, wrote to McGeorge Bundy, gently critiquing the logic of reprisal as Bundy had laid it out to the President in that earlier memo. Meeker suggested that the United States should avoid, quote, reliance on theories of reprisal or retaliation which are less readily available under contemporary international law than they were before the Charter. And he noted the inconsistency in US reliance on reprisal or retaliation with respect to Vietnam when we have been publicly critical of such justifications in other circumstances. For example, in the Near East and situations involving Israel and the Arab states. Instead of relying on a justification of reprisal, Meeker argued that for his own proposed legal basis for the airstrikes, based on the right of collective self-defense under the UN Charter, and he said this would be, again quoting, politically more appealing in presenting our case to other governments and in the court of public opinion around the world. Meeker's advice won out, and reprisal never constituted a formal legal rationale for launching airstrikes against North Vietnam. But while the language of reprisal and retaliation was struck from the official American vocabulary of justification, the underlying logic of reprisal proved much harder to dislodge. And one prominent example of that comes later that same year in December 1965. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was the US ambassador to South Vietnam at that time, made further calls for reprisals when, in December 65, the National Liberation Front bombed Saigon's Metropole Hotel. The Metropole Hotel was serving as a billet for US personnel at the time. Now, since February in 1965, Washington had considered and rejected the idea of launching specifically designated reprisal strikes in the wake of several high-profile incidents. The bombing of the US Embassy in March, the bombing of a restaurant in June, and the execution of enemy-held US servicemen in June and September, all of 1965. And now, after the Metropole bombing in December 65, Washington decided to meet Lodge and his team halfway. They wrote to the embassy that, quote, a strike should be carried out in response to this Metropole bombing, but that it should not, repeat, not be represented as reprisal for Metropole incident. Elaborating on their reasoning for this position, the Washington-based officials essentially repeated Meeker's arguments from February for rejecting the legal logic of reprisal. They wrote that the background of rejecting use of reprisal was, quote, that the US government has repeatedly joined in denunciation of specific reprisal actions, as in Yemen, Algeria, and Israel. Explicit reprisal rationale will also raise serious questions on future incidents. But basic reason is to avoid serious international repercussions for actions that we believe are in fact distinguishable from the cases we have denounced, but that could not easily be separated from those cases in the face of criticism. So a strategic logic of reprisal was operating whilst a legal logic was being shunned. The target that was chosen as the reprisal, not reprisal attack in December 1965 was a thermal power plant. And it was struck on the 15th of December and again on the 22nd of December. In response to any questions that might arise, the embassy was instructed by Washington to note that the target is directly related to military installations in the area being used in support of continuing infiltration and aggression in the south by the North Vietnamese regime, and that the whole targeting pattern of bombings in North is of course related to level of VC action in the south, with the Metropole incident being only one of a number of acts indicating continued high level of terrorism and infiltration. So again, we see this idea of a pattern of aggression that the US is responding to, or making the case for a pattern of aggression. Speaking from Washington, the US Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, towed the same line, declaring publicly that the attack was representative of the type we have carried out and will continue to carry out. I would not characterize it as retaliatory, said McNamara, but I think it is appropriate to the increased terror activity. One thing which this allows for the US to do is that if there's a strategic logic of reprisal in operation here, but that's denied in terms of law and in terms of justification, it served to expand the categories of targets that the US hit in North Vietnam. And this was an expansive category, or a category in that was expanding anyway, but this allows the normalization of new categories of targets to come into the Rolling Thunder air campaign that was being carried out at the time. So by denying that old legal logic of reprisal, by denying the very limited legal nature of what reprisal could do, the US is in effect expanding the category of targets that they're giving themselves the right to hit. So the formal rejection of reprisals as a justification for belligerent actions in Vietnam can be assessed in various ways. Two early analysts of the air war over North Vietnam wrote, and they were distinguishing between reprisal and retaliation. They wrote that reprisal raids could have opened the door to consistent and unjustifiable attack upon civilian objects in North Vietnam. It is admirable that the United States Air Force never sought to justify on this tenuous and debatable ground the use of an estimated 7 million tons of bombs over Indochina. But did the rejection of reprisals as a public justification matter if the logic of reprisals still underlay at least some of US bombing policy? In the context of the Vietnam War, perhaps it mattered, as US officials hoped it would in terms of domestic and international public opinion, that arguments of self-defense were more palatable to Americans and to the international community than were arguments of reprisal, which had a long and contentious history. But it may also have mattered outside the military and humanitarian context of the Vietnam War, in the context of shifting understandings of responsibilities under the UN Charter and of rights of self-defense. The rejection of reprisals allowed for the rise of other US interpretations for the right to use force in the Vietnam War, subsidiaries of the right to self-defense. And these include the unable or unwilling doctrine that Victor talked a little bit about this morning, that emerged in US legal argumentation after the 1970 Cambodian incursion. But we should also ask whether the US position against reprisals in Vietnam which was, as you'll recall from those statements from Leonard Mika, in part a product of its position against reprisals in the Arab-Israeli conflict, in turn flowed back into the Middle East conflict and affected interpretations for the right to use force there. What was the pattern of legal migration between these two conflict zones? And how did the formal rejection of reprisals, while wanting to retain a strategic logic of reprisal, affect the argumentation that was going on between these two conflict zones? Novel interpretations of self-defense, some of which consciously incorporate elements of reprisals, such as defensive armed reprisal, a term used by the Israeli international lawyer Yoram Dinstein. Are they the result of some form of legal triangulation that seeks to take account of the anti-reprisal US position whilst maintaining that Schelling-like strategic logic? And more generally, in what ways did legal arguments about self-defense migrate between the Vietnam War context and the Arab-Israeli context? It's these hints in the archival record that I found, particularly with Mika's statements that what the US had said and argued in respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict prior to 1965 had some effect on the argumentation that was being made in the Vietnam conflict. Now, those statements, of course, were made before or at a time of US foreign policy where US views on the Arab-Israeli conflict were perhaps more in flux, weren't quite in the same space that we see after 1967, again, as Victor talked a little bit about this morning. So the legal argumentation that's made by Mika and others before 1967 has some after effect, but it might not be perhaps the effect that he intended. Has the effect of mutating perhaps some justifications around self-defense and the use of force, including reprisals, including the unwilling and unable doctrine that Victor mentioned was used by Israel in regard to its attacks on the PLO in Lebanon in the late 70s, early 80s. And I don't have any, I haven't looked into the Middle East case sufficiently yet to think exactly about what those connections might be. But I think certainly the hints in the archival record suggest that they're very real and that bringing people together in a conference like this to discuss them is very useful. So I'll finish there. Thank you.